Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Get CME for this episode by clicking on the CME link in the show notes. Today, we welcome back Tod Stillson. He's a family physician, entrepreneur. Today's Kevin MD article is Dismantling the Mythical Dichotomy of Physician Career Options. Tod, welcome back to the show.
Kevin, it's great to be with you and your audience. I always enjoy talking to you and really hearing from the audience after these podcasts.
All right. So Todd's been on multiple times. Go to kevinmd.com/podcast to hear his story and prior episodes. But let's talk about your most recent article, Dismantling the Mythical Dichotomy of Physician Career Options. What's this one about?
Yeah, context is everything. I work with second-year residents, precepting them in rural family medicine rotations in my clinic, my rural clinic. I also have a son who happens to be a second-year family medicine resident. And as I kind of watch these doctors kind of go through their process of determining how they're going to enter the marketplace, what I see really is they're just funneled over and over and herded over and over again into the idea that they're just going to go into traditional employment. And they kind of have this mindset that they really just have two options. One is traditional employment, 90% are doing that, or perhaps wade into the waters of private practice. About 10% or less are doing that. And that part's really scary to them. So they sort of just almost mindlessly just choose employment without thinking about it. And I think there's a lot of options beyond those two options that for physicians. And the point of the article is just to bring that forward to let people know they have options.
All right. So let's talk about some of those options outside of that dichotomy. What exactly are we talking about?
Yeah, I think the third space that I really see is emerging, because I talk to doctors every week with Simply MD about this, is the idea of forming a micro corporation around yourself to kind of house your professional services, and then contracting out those services to various companies that want to use your medical services around the country. And so that's a bit different than traditional employment, obviously, where you're just going to work for one employer, getting one paycheck and working in one location typically, and a bit different than working for a private practice or in a private practice. Those two elements are really still very tightly connected to the system, so to speak. Okay. And so there are a growing number of opportunities for doctors to work and use their professional skills and their professional services in ways that don't entangle them in the system quite as much. They maintain a little more autonomy, a little more control. I call that the third space. It's a very diverse third space, and a physician can pick and choose a host of options that they want to use for it. But a lot of times, young doctors in particular, but even mid-level or mid-career doctors, just don't know there's any other option.
Now, is this something similar to locums where they can contract out their expertise to a variety of different entities?
Yeah, I would call it that's very similar to locums. So locums is the traditional way of that space where you would do a short term. Locums typically considered a short term contract with an entity to provide your professional services. And locums has been around for a number of years, and it's a growing space. But locums is just one example of what contracting space looks like when it comes to your professional services. For example, its companion, that's the best alternative to traditional employment, is employment light. Employment light is long-term independent contracting, where locums is short-term independent contracting. So those are just two elements associated with that idea of being an independent contractor. But quite honestly, you still can go into private practice, but you want to do it in a way that kind of uses your own corporation in the process. It'll protect you a little bit. And there's really a host of other spaces that you can do as a doctor to use professional services. You just have to really know the full menu of options before you just blindly choose the idea of doing traditional employment. That's where I feel like a lot of doctors have kind of missed things a bit. We're used to following the herd, right? So Kevin, when
Mm-hmm.
you were in training, what did you do after you completed your first year? You did what all the second years did.
Mm-hmm.
You just turned the knob, you went to the second year. After your second year, go to your third year. After you graduate, you just keep following where the herd's going. And the sad truth is the herd for doctors today and where it's going isn't the best place. And you don't maybe not know that right at the beginning, but 3 to 5, maybe 10 years into it, you'll find that's not the best space for you to be in. And so I think trying to provide opportunities and solutions for doctors to build the foundation of their careers on something besides just traditional employment is important. So I really want to try and communicate that to the audience today, and there's others that we can talk about.
So I think that dichotomy exists because residency programs themselves may not even be aware of that third rail
Mm,
career paths, right?
yeah.
And that it just reinforces the traditional dichotomy.
It sure does. I mean, you think about it. I mean, your faculty mentors are employees, so they work in the employed world. They're very steeped in that, and so that's what they know. That's what they're going to really lead you towards. There may be a few faculty members who've had experience in private practice, or maybe still some connections with people in private practice, but the modeling of what you see in your windshield as a young doctor really is mostly traditional employment and occasionally private practice. You're not exposed to this host of other options typically, and so again, you just kind of really fall into the trap of just doing what everybody else is doing. And I think that's part of that experience in this 3 to 5 years. That's why about 50% of doctors change jobs after 3 to 5 years, right? You kind of wake up and
Mhm.
you go, wait a second, I don't have to do it this way. I can have some other options. You get more exposure when you're in the marketplace. So trying to get a greater exposure for young doctors and mid-career doctors before they feel like they're stuck is really valuable and important. So they really honestly can enter the marketplace with an idea of what they want to do as opposed to reacting later and trying to make a change. Change is harder later. It's easier to start from the beginning in that third rail.
Now you mentioned employment light. We've talked about that in prior
Hmm.
episodes. Go to kevinmd.com/podcast. You can search for employment light to hear more about that. But just to give in a nutshell, early career physicians or physicians in residency, just in 30 seconds or less, what are the main advantages of that third space for these new physicians just coming out?
The biggest advantage is they retain their autonomy. So when you're able to put yourself in a position to maintain your professional autonomy, you're going to control your career. The second most important part is you're going to also diversify your income channels. So you're not going to be dependent upon one employer's income channel. You're going to have more diverse income channels. And then the third is basically you have greater tax optimization options. So those three things are the very key elements to that third rail.
Now, when you bring this option up to young physicians, even your son, in terms
Mhm.
of their response? What do they say to you? What kind of response do you get when you bring this previously unknown path up to these residents?
They're actually very interested. It's fascinating, and I've spoken to multiple residency groups about these options, and I don't know, they're like little kids feeding, eating ice cream.
Yeah.
They're just like taking it in with wide eyes, like, wow, nobody's ever talked about this to me. I didn't know this was an option. They find it very interesting. And I guess in some regards, younger generation physicians in particular are kind of used to gig economy ideas and the ideas of
Yeah.
contracting a little bit more. So it's sort of easier for them to embrace the concept, but then when it's applied to the world of medicine, they begin to see the light bulbs turn on and they see a whole lot of other options, that as an example, direct primary care is a great option,
Yeah.
okay, like for a lot of young doctors. And so they don't feel like they need to either become a traditional employee, they don't feel like they need to go into quote private practice, but if they go into direct primary care, which is kind of working around the system, so to speak, to directly contract with the patient themselves, those are great options. And knowing that those are options are important. Telemedicine is another great one, Kevin. I mean, shoot, one of my kids needed to see a specialist recently. And in our geographic area, those specialists are really, really hard to get into and like take months to get into. Well, we use a telehealth platform to arrange for a consultation for one of my kids. I mean, I had an appointment in 3 days,
Mhm.
okay, with a legitimate board certified specialist to manage a particular issue. So telemedicine is breaking down huge barriers and boundaries all over the country. And that alone is an amazing space and option for doctors to work in, as an example.
So give us some case studies or examples of resident physicians that you've worked with and they've actually come out and practice in a non-traditional arrangement. Just give us some examples of what that scenario would look like for those listeners who just
Yeah.
want to see some practicality to some of these concepts.
So a lot of times it starts by this, whether it be they heard a podcast from you or I, or saw one of my blogs. Most commonly, I actually get it from my book. I wrote a book called Doctor Incorporated, Stop the Insanity of Traditional Employment and Preserve Your Professional Autonomy. You can get it on Amazon. But not uncommon, I have somebody read the book, then they reach out to me and say, wow, I read this. This is an amazing book. How's come nobody's ever told me about this? And so I explained the process. I had a cardiologist reach out to me who was finishing up his fellowship, and he's like, I want to do this. I think this is an important option for me to do an employment-like contract through a hospital and that I'm going to work with. And I really want to get this organized. And he had been looking at traditional employment options up to that point and had done some interviews even. So I coached him a little bit, told him about the options, reviewed things, talked about both long-term independent contracting, i.e. employment light, and short-term independent contracting, locums. So what this cardiologist did was once he caught the vision for it and was inspired to do it, he stopped the traditional employment process he was going through, recalculated, kind of reset himself, chose to take on a locums contract to just give himself some space, doing some work for 3 or 4 months just to get himself organized, then began to shop around in a different way to the hospitals who are willing to sign him on as a long-term independent contractor, and identified ones that would, and chose to engage in a contractual relationship with them as a long-term independent contractor. At the same time, simultaneously, he was working with a telehealth company to read Echo online as well, sort of a side hustle in addition to the core job that he was doing.
Mhm.
So kind of in summary, this doctor sort of began to see himself for the first time as an independent contractor at power as a micro business, chose not to enter into the traditional employment model, waded into the marketplace as a contractor, got some experience as a short term, then led to a long term and developed telehealth contracts, and as happy and pleased as could be because he has control over his life. The side story to that is that he has a family on the East Coast, and he's able to do some of the work that he's doing not on the East Coast because of just the way the process works with being able to contract out your services. And so he's been able to maintain a home where he wants, but still use his professional skills to practice elsewhere, sometimes electronically even, to still accomplish the lifestyle that he prefers, income that he wants, multiple sources, independence, and living where he wants. So that's a great story of some success related to just having the inspiration to know that something is an option. And if you don't know it's an option, you're going to do what he just about did. And that was follow the herd, sign up as a traditional employee, and just do what everybody else is doing.
I can imagine that there are some residents with hundreds of thousands of dollars of loans, right? Three, four,
Yeah.
500,000
Mhm.
dollars, and you look at a typical employment contract. There's a perception of security, and they want to start their life. They have to buy a house and things like that, and they may offer that perceived security of an employed position. So, are you encountering that? Are you
Oh,
encountering that
100%.
perception?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's no question that large corporations in the marketplace are aware of that need that doctors have. And so they're playing to that, right? So they are looking to create financially incentivized or laden contracts that sort of secure a doctor's services for 3 to 5 years, right? So there's kind of often a payback process into that work. And if you stay with them for so long, they'll eliminate the debt and yada, yada, yada. And so that for a lot of doctors, if you have a large debt, that's not a bad deal. I mean, don't get me wrong. Sometimes you come down to that financial decision where you might choose to do a certain type of work for a certain length of time because there's going to be some financial benefits to you. But in your big picture, you might be beginning to organize yourself behind the scenes. In that particular case, as an example, if you signed on as a W-2, you might do some job stacking. You might sign on as a W-2 at a 0.8 equivalent, full-time equivalent in that job. Leave yourself a 0.2 equivalent full-time for doing side work, right? And then at the
Mhm.
same time, you're doing that work for that big company who's paying off your debt. You're still doing a little bit of side work, developing your skill set for your own independent contracting. And when that contract's up, you can choose to stay add more or layer in more side jobs, or even leave and go into another area that you want to diversify in. But there's no question that large corporations recognize the needs that young doctors have and the financial debts that they have. That's another reason why young doctors often choose not to go into private practice nowadays, right? You have $350,000 in debt coming out of residency, and then you look at a buy-in process into a private practice arrangement, you're just talking about just a lot of steep cost involved in that whole process. And most of them are eager to begin eliminating the debt, not adding more debt as they practice. That's the beauty and power of a microcorporation, though. Microcorporation is a practice without walls, and there's really you're a single member. There's really little to no overhead, and you're not taking on extra debt in the process beyond the cost of just forming the corporation. And so it's not a lot of extra cost, but provides you a lot of opportunities to diversify your income channels that can pay down the debt. So again, job stacking is the combination, but some may choose to go into traditional employment just for a season to eliminate the debt.
We're talking to Tod Stillson, family physician and entrepreneur. His most recent Kevin MD article is Dismantling the Mythical Dichotomy of Physician Career Options. Now, when you ask residency programs to speak to the residents and introduce this kind of unconventional approach,
Yeah,
do you ever get pushback from
absolutely, I
the
do.
program leaders and things like that? What kind of things do you hear?
Here's the deal. Most of these programs are aligned with the big hospital. They're aligned with their big facility. And they have that there's built-in soft recruiting, so to speak, that's associated with all these residency programs. And that's why that's one of their main reasons, or one of their reasons for hosting a residency. And so when they have somebody come in and present an option that's different than traditional employment, frankly, they're a little bit scared about that because they're afraid they might lose those young doctors in terms of the recruiting process. So I do get pushback from residency directors that I have good relationships with, and they're like, "Tod, you're right. Doctor, these residency directors are like shepherds over these young doctors. They're like, yeah, my people need to know this stuff. But you know what? I got people above me that are going to say no, and I can't do it." So the workaround to that at times, I've done with this with other residency directors, is we have a resident choose to host an event in their home that's not residency affiliated, and have me come in, speak to 10, 15 residents, and it's just an invite, come if you want. It's not required by the residency, so to speak. But again, universally, when I do those sort of conversations with young doctors, it's just a great turnout, and they're just all eyes and love it. So, but I do get pushback from the institutions because they're afraid of offering alternatives, honestly.
And my final question, Tod, your take-home messages to the Kevin MD audience.
My take-home message is, before you think that there's only one option, pause, look around, explore all opportunities, realize that you do have the power to incorporate yourself, and using that power of incorporation to enter the marketplace provides you with the greatest sense of autonomy in terms of your professional services, but also amplify the number of options that you have for working in the marketplace. And I'm just going to list these off real quick. I know this is a summary, but you can do it in private practice. You can do it as independent contracting. You do it in job stacking. You can do it in direct care models. You can do it in telemedicine, consulting, blogs, coaching. There are so many ways that you can do the diversification process with your professional services based on the hard work that you've done to earn your degree and earn your license. And I encourage you not to just blindly fall into traditional employment being your only option.
Thank you once again for sharing your perspective and insight. Thanks again for coming back on the show.
Thanks, Kevin.